Hello, today we're going to be talking about Chapter 14, specifically looking at high school and college sports. Typically, this tends to be a really interesting chapter for most of you because you've either just got done with high school athletics in some capacity, some of you are currently playing college sports. So it's a really interesting chapter. It is a long one, so I am going to try to get through the slideshow pretty fast, but make sure that you get through the PowerPoint at your pace and make sure that you read the chapter thoroughly. So go ahead to the first slide, which has the Georgia basketball player on it. The United States is what's really unique about us is that we're the only country who essentially integrates sports with our education. And some of you that might not be news to, others I'm sure it is. So we're the only place that really sponsors and funds sports through our education programs. Go ahead to the next slide. So go ahead and get everything up here. There's lots of points here. We're going to be talking about the arguments for and against intercollegiate sports. And this is something I really want you to not only read in the book, but, take a look at this slide and kind of come to a conclusion yourself. And don't just have a gut reaction of like, yes, absolutely sports should be in school. I really want you to take some time to think about it. I'm not going to go through all these arguments for and against, but essentially, the arguments for are, really about the positive effect it has on individuals and then the student body as a whole. The arguments against is that the damage it does to these individuals, both educationally and physically, and the resources that it takes away. So I want you to think about, whether or not you're for or against sports being in schools, and it's a topic that that's really being discussed right now as a whole, whether certain sports should continue to be in colleges for a lot of different reasons and in the high school. Go to the next slide. So those who try out and make and stay in school sports often have unique traits. This makes it difficult to, really kind of understand what effects sports have on players. So what they're saying is that individuals who choose to play varsity athletics already have certain traits and characteristics. So we don't really know, if it's affecting them positively or negatively. It's already difficult to tell. Go ahead to the next slide. In the U.S., again, is the only country in the world where high schools and colleges fund elite sports, including cheerleading. Go on to the next slide. So experiences of high school athletes. So research shows there are differences between students who play varsity sports and those who don't. Most of the difference are due to selection in and filtering out in-season control processes. So essentially what it's saying is those who play varsity sports, which I already told you before, have pre-existing characteristics that make them different than players who decide not to play. So you already have characteristics that were existent before you even chose to play a varsity sport. Go ahead to the next slide. So here are some problems when you're talking about researching, varsity sports. One, the growth and development among students is related to too many factors beyond playing sports. So when you're looking at individuals who are going through high school, their growth and development, there's so many things that are playing a factor into that. Parents, friends, the education that they're in, just their, natural biological changes. There's so many things that are influencing who they're becoming. Sports is just a very small piece of it. So it's difficult to really evaluate how big an effect playing varsity sports is having. Another problem is meaning given to the sports participation. As we've talked about a ton this, over these last 6 weeks is, depending on the meaning that these individuals or the school or the team gives the sports, it really varies. So that, could have a difference, could influence an individual differently as well. Go ahead to the next slide. So what research is telling us, okay? So we got to, number one, be very careful when we're generalizing education's value in sports. And I'll be honest, this is one thing I think as a whole, the students I work with do. You guys are very quick to say, like, absolutely, it's a completely positive thing. It should obviously be in schools, and there's really no negative behind it. That's a real general statement, and you need some concrete information before you go and make those types of statements. There needs to be more of this, if longitude and quantitative studies done to really understand the sports participation. Varsity athletes may be treated differently by significant others. And I think we could all say to some degree that may have occurred, or somebody who has been treated differently by, significant others because they're playing sports. This is going to continue to the next slide, which research also tells us that varsity sport influences the larger student culture, but we don't know much about this. So that we know that varsity sports at high school do influence the entire student body, but we don't know how and how deep it goes. The impact of sports participation, again, depends on the meaning given to it, and you're going to see that a lot throughout this. Go ahead to the next slide. So meaning given to sports participation varies, and there's 3 different factors. One, the status given to the athletes in the sports. So meaning how important is that sport within the school, and how important are those athletes? So the example I like to give is the high school I went to, okay? Our men's basketball team, really big deal. Went to state every year. It was one of the more important sports at my high school that I went to when I was there. Women's basketball, terrible. Okay, nobody came to our games. It was not important at all. It was really kind of second tier. So the meaning for the high school was very different. Another example I like to give, the high school I went to, women's soccer, really big deal. Everybody went to the game. There was a lot of importance on it. Men's soccer, not so much. So it really kind of depends. And this was all in the same high school, both, sexes, and there was a big difference. The identities that young people develop as they play the sports, the ways that young people integrate the sports and identity into their lives. Go ahead to the next slide. So research indicates that the effects of playing sports in school depend on a couple different things. The context in which they're played, how the sport is organized, and the social characteristics of the athletes. Go ahead to the next slide. So the school culture in high school, and this is where, again, it would be great if we were all together, because this is where we would start to discuss what your high schools were like, and the kind of culture that you had around sports. I can only kind of speak to you about my experience when I was in high school. Sports were really important at the high school I went to, really important and a really big deal. And overall, we were at that time very good at the majority of our sports. Being a student athlete is often associated with a certain status and popularity. And this is what I would love to hear from you guys within your discussion questions or your personal learning post. Was in your school, was there a status behind playing athletics? There was at my high school, 100%, in certain sports. Again, you're a women's basketball player, that didn't necessarily give you any status or popularity, but if you were a women's soccer player, it certainly did. More young men, this is more for young men than women. Sports are sites for major social occasions in school. So when they say that, what comes to mind right away? I'll tell you, pep rallies, dances, parades. I mean, there's all sorts of things that when you think about it, it's like, wow. So we have a whole school event because of a football game, or we have a whole week and it leads up to the football game, or we have a pep rally before the big basketball game. So it is kind of crazy to think about, how many pep rallies did you have for the musical? How many big events did you have to celebrate the choir heading to state? And maybe some of you did, and that's what I would love to hear about, but I would say the majority of us have not. Sports often reproduce dominant ideologies, gender, social class, race, and ethnicity. Go ahead to the next slide. So before 1980, which we've already touched on this, high school girls, sports were often viewed very negatively. It was not a status symbol at all to play athletics. Today, young women feel more comfortable, participating in sports. And again, it definitely could be, something of a status symbol. Go ahead to the next slide. Some women's sports now actually receive equal attention to some of the men's sports, even at the collegiate level. And if you think about, some of you might not be soccer fans, but the women's U.S. soccer team has, traditionally actually gotten more attention than the men's soccer team. Now that's shifting for sure, but there was definitely more attention put on the women than the men. Go ahead to the next slide. So now we're on the slide about intercollegiate sports, and how they're most likely to be positive if these things happen. So, they're going to be a positive and positively linked to a learning experience if it enables students to be noticed, rewarded, and taken seriously as human beings. So if they're participating in sports, they're also going to do well in school if they're, really looked at and rewarded for the effort that they're putting in, and they're taken serious, that they're, doing something productive. Connect with young people, adult advocates and mentors, and are explicitly linked with non-sport situations and how they succeed in them. Again, this is just difficult to study though. Go ahead to the next slide. The experience of college athletes. So I'm going to get everything up here. Intercollegiate sports are not all the same, and they vary, which again is obvious. So in intercollegiate sports, there's the NCAA, and there's lots of different divisions, and it's not just the NCAA.Re's NAIA, there's community colleges, so there's some different divisions. In the book, specifically discusses the NCAA. There's 3 divisions right now: Division 1, 2, and 3. I'm not going to go in a ton of detail, but Division 1 and 2 are allowed to give athletic scholarships, where Division 3 is not. So that's kind of the variance and differences. But, you have to understand that just because a school gives athletic scholarship doesn't necessarily mean they have better athletes, that they're more serious about their sports. There would be a lot of us, including myself, Division 3 coaches, that would argue that, we have incredibly talented athletes who are very committed to their sports and potentially more committed, and I know for sure on my team I can say more talented than some athletes that are receiving athletic scholarships. So there's also the type of program and team. That even just varies. If we were just talking about Division 3, which we are all accustomed to here at Wartburg, a women's soccer team in our conference at X school is quite different than even our women's soccer team and how they function and the expectations. The culture that are created on the teams, if we were just looking at Wartburg, I think it would be fair to say that a lot of our teams have different cultures. We might all be driven to achieve the same thing, but how we're doing it and what is important to us is will vary. The importance of sports on the campus. I would argue here at Wartburg, athletics are very important here. We take them very seriously. We're very successful at them. It's kind of our thing here. In addition to, we're very good at, music, and that's kind of our thing too. And we are very important. There's conference schools though, in my opinion, that sports aren't as important and they don't take it as serious. So, every college athlete is going to have a different experience depending on these factors. Go ahead to the next slide. So characteristics of the big time Division I schools. So when I'm saying big time, I'm talking about Alabama, the University of Florida, Iowa State, the University of Iowa. I'm talking about the big dogs. And then there's kind of the second tier Division I schools, which is going to be like UNI, the University of Milwaukee, University of UW Milwaukee, University of UW Green Bay. I don't even know if Loyola's in Chicago. Those are kind of the second tier Division I. So we're going to look at the big time Division I. Usually emphasis on football and men's basketball, because those are the big dogs that are going to bring in the money. Revenues can be high, but very few teams or athletic departments make more than they spend, which we've already discussed. And, I will be interested to read some of your thoughts on this. And, with Title IX, when we talked about that, a couple chapters ago, there's still some confusion among you that, kind of talk about how men's sports are getting, slighted. Well, again, they can reallocate that money. They can take money from football and basketball and make sure not to cut men's sports, but these colleges decide not to do that. The easiest way to be in compliance is just to get rid of a men's sport. Athletic scholarships may vary, or athletic scholarships may be awarded within the limits set of the NCAA, and they may vary, is what I want to tell you. So what I mean by that is, for example, women's soccer at Division I, they are allowed 13 full scholarships for women's soccer. So that's what the NCAA says. You get 13 full scholarships. Well, these Division I schools don't have to abide by that. And I won't say which Division I school, but there's a Division I school in the region. They don't get all 13 scholarships. They get less than that to work with. Teams often travel, extensively. If you read my bio, I played Division I soccer for 2 years at the University of Green Bay, second tier Division I, as I would call it, and we traveled a ton, and it was on a bus. Now, some of the big dogs will fly, absolutely, but you also take a bus quite a bit. I mean, even schools like University of Iowa and Iowa State will take buses for 8, 9, 10 hours. There's a lot of travel that's involved. And then the quality of skill and competition, though, is very high. The stakes are higher. Obviously, these individuals are getting paid to play. Go ahead to the next slide. So athletes in big time programs, participants in revenue sports often have the scholarships. Time and energy commitment to the sport is incredibly high, and participants must often choose between working out and practicing sports, doing coursework, and engaging in social activities. I can only speak of my Division I experience. It definitely 110%, was soccer and school were kind of like this, and then everything else was underneath. You made your class schedules around your practice schedule and your workout schedule. You didn't pick your classes and then make it work. It was very much, this is the time we're practicing and you are not allowed to schedule classes. Obviously, we missed a lot of school to our travels, and then, doing any outside clubs or organizations was almost nearly impossible, just because of already the time commitment that you had to your sport, and then on top of that, you were doing school. Academic detachment is commonly used in a coping strategy among male athletes. So in order to kind of sift through all of this, they kind of detach from their coursework. Go ahead to the next slide. So this slide here just talks about how, essentially college athletes are playing in front of huge crowds every single Saturday for football games. How would you focus on, a biology test when you're going to play Notre Dame in front of 80,000 people? The importance kind of is like, I think this is more important. Go to the next slide. So grades and graduation rates among college athletes. So they're kind of confusing and they can be disputed. Information on the grades must be kind of quantified or qualified, if you will. Athletes often are overrepresented in a certain course or major. So there's like clustering, there's certain majors that they all kind of flock to. We're talking about at the major Division I schools. We're not talking like Wartburg right now. Athletes in entertainment-oriented sports often enter college with lower grades and standards than the other entering students. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. Grades and graduation rates continued here. Graduation rates among all varsity athletes are slightly higher than, for all students. And there's some reasons for that. Obviously, there's expectations so that they can be eligible to play, and they're kind of in a more structured environment. A lot of these big time schools are going to have academic tutors and study times and all this stuff that they have to do, which would make it, easier for them to graduate. Graduation rates in some big time revenue sports are shamefully low. And there's some reasons for that. Some of them don't graduate because they go on to play professional, but that's a very small amount. So a lot of times students will, have this pre-assumption, well, yeah, they don't graduate, but that's because they're going on to play. It's a very tiny amount in the scheme of things. So there's some other reasons why it's shamefully low. They're not taking the classes, and then once they're done playing, they just decide not to finish and things like that. Female athletes have a higher graduation rate than male athletes, and that's even true non-athlete wise. Black athletes have graduation rates are higher than black athletes, students as a whole, but they're much lower than white athletes. Go ahead to the next slide. So athletes who are most successful in balancing academic and their athletic commitments, they have past experiences that have really encouraged them to do well educationally and really have made an emphasis that education is important. They have social networks that are supportive of that. One example I like to give is my women's soccer team. I can say this pretty confidently. In general, they're pretty driven in the classroom. So when we're in the bus together, and they're all studying, it's easy to get out a book, so their social network already provides them an environment that they have their friends and their teammates are doing work, so they do too. Perceived access to career opportunities after graduation. So essentially, they already think about, I'm going to get a job, or I need to get a job kind of mentality. The social relationships, again, and experiences provide them confidence and the skills to do well. So academic integrity in college sports. So essentially, resorting and maintaining academic integrity is difficult. Athletic success is tied to big money. So put it simply, it's hard because these colleges want these students to be playing because they bring in money for the college. But then at the same time, they have to be doing the work and doing good work and being in class. So there's some conflict there. Raising academic standards is important, but it also does unfairly exclude certain students. So, the current sanctions right now, if a college is not up to par, would be reduction of scholarships, banning schools from postseason games, or suspending the entire athletic department if the graduation rates fall below a certain number for several years. It's not just a 1-year thing. So academic support programs, and this would be, something even to think about, like, what does Wartburg provide? If any of you are athletes or friends with athletes, what do they provide? Academic support programs, there's research needed because it really varies. And again, at the University of Green Bay, we had an academic tutor, advisor, if you will, assigned to each team, and we had study tables, but overall there wasn't a lot of checks and balances where I was at. Recent media coverage suggests that some programs focus more on eligibility than learning. So what these advisors, these tutors are trying to do is just make sure to keep them eligible. They don't really care if they're learning or advancing. They just want to make sure their GPA and credits are at a certain place so that they can play. Too many programs are administered by the athletic department rather than a tenured faculty member. So, it's somebody within the athletic department. Again, a little bit of conflict of interest there because they are, wanting the teams to do well. Go ahead to the next slide. So recent reforms and big time programs, I'm not going to read through all this, but there's been new rules to really regulate this and make sure that colleges are essentially trying to take care of their student athlete. They're supposed to be a student first, and that gets a little bit cloudy from time to time. Go ahead to the next slide. So questions about the benefits of varsity sports. So we're going to first look at, just in general, what are some of the benefits? So high school spirit may enhance, but does it really improve the academic climate? So, just because you have sports at your high school and they do well or they bring everybody together, do you actually see a growth in, how kids are doing in school? Are they really, really invested? They don't really know. And I know some of you are going to say, like, yeah, I mean, same as college, you had to stay eligible, you had to do the stuff, but does it really increase how everybody is doing? Spirit on college campus, enhanced by sport, but not for all students. So big time sport events are made into social occasions where students party, binge drink, and avoid library and study less. So think about on Saturday at the University of Iowa during the fall when there's a home football game. Tailgating starting early and the game doesn't start till 1, it gets done around 5, and then you're out and about. So no studying is getting done that day. I mean, honestly. So, even though it's bringing everybody together, again, is it really kind of providing an environment that's really supportive of academics? Okay, go ahead to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed a click here. Community experience is often enhanced, most likely when teams win regularly, but the impact of spirit on high school and colleges has not really been, systematically studied. Essentially, it has not been looked at. Go ahead to the next slide now. So questions about the benefits of varsity sports and budgets, like how much money they cost. High school sports budget varies greatly. So, there's going to be some high schools that have a ton of money for their sports. There's going to be other high schools that don't have a lot. And then it's also going to vary between sports and sex. Nearly all college sports programs lose money. Okay, again, this notion that all the big time men's sports make money and all this stuff. It's just not true. Are the losses worth the academic and development terms? Losses are covered primarily by student fees. So students who attend these universities that do not play varsity athletics, their student fees are essentially covering what the athletic department loses. Is that really fair? Is that right? Again, I'm not telling you it is or it isn't. I just want you to critically think about that. Is that something that really should be done? And why or why not? Are the public and community relations function of varsity sports worth their cost? Like, do community fans of sports interfere or make contributions? Go to the next slide. Sports and high school budgets, okay, so these vary. In the face of budget problems, schools use these strategies. They make sports participation fees. I would ask you, if you were all together, did you have a sports participation fee? And the feedback I've gotten from previous classes is that it varies. We've had some that, zero, it costs nothing. We have others that said, yeah, it costs $400 to $500 for me to play, and then my sibling got to, was only $100, or, we had to pay this, and this. Does it cost something to participate? Depend on the support from the booster clubs and seeks corporate sponsors. As injuries become more of an issue, you got to get more protective equipment, and these high schools have to get liability insurance. And there's been a lot of discussion about football specifically, and I don't think, I think soccer will also be in this discussion, whether it's, really a good thing to have in our high schools, because unfortunately there's all these injuries happening, head injuries, and the liability is increasing, and, there's going to be some costs there. So they've been discussing how are they going to deal with football.